My name is Sydney, and I am 31 years old. 5 days after I gave birth to premature twins, my mother-in-law walked into my hospital room with my husband, his mistress, and a bank check for $45 million. She wanted to buy my children and erase me from their wealthy Atlanta family forever. I did not scream or cry. I simply smiled, signed the divorce papers, took her millions, and vanished into the night. By the time the sun came up over Buckhead, she realized her entire real estate empire had just been balanced to zero. If you have ever been treated like you do not belong by the people who were supposed to be your family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to hear exactly how I made them pay for every single insult. The air in the VIP recovery room at Piedmont Hospital was heavy with the smell of antiseptic and the quiet, rhythmic beeping of the infant heart monitors. I sat in the oversized leather armchair holding my tiny son and daughter against my chest. They were born early, and every breath they took was a hard-won victory. I was exhausted wearing a faded cotton robe and surviving on zero sleep. Then the heavy wooden door swung open without a knock. My mother-in-law, Valerie, marched in wearing a pristine white suit that looked completely absurd in a maternity ward. Behind her stood my husband of 3 years, Malcolm, who kept his eyes glued to the linoleum floor. And right beside him, clinging to his arm, was his 25-year-old assistant, Brianna. My eyes instantly locked onto the bag hanging from Brianna's shoulder. It was a limited edition designer bag, the exact same one I had purchased for Malcolm to give to a high-profile client the month before. Seeing it on her arm told me everything I needed to know before anyone even spoke a word. Valerie did not bother to look at her newborn grandchildren. She marched straight to my bed and threw a thick manila folder onto the mattress, followed by a heavy embossed bank check. "Take this $45 million and drag yourself back to the West End where you belong, Sydney." Valerie sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "This family bloodline needs a truly high-class mother. We need someone who understands Buckhead society, not some low-level bean counter from a historically black college. Your little Spelman degree might impress your neighborhood friends, but in our world, you are nothing but a glorified calculator." I looked at the check, $45 million. Then I looked at Malcolm, my golden child husband. The man who had promised to build a life with me was now hiding behind his mother, staring at his expensive Italian loafers. "Malcolm," I said, keeping my voice dangerously soft, "are you really going to let your mother buy your children and hand them over to your assistant?" Malcolm shifted uncomfortably, pulling away from Brianna just a fraction. He finally looked up, his eyes full of cowardice. "Sydney, just sign the papers. My mother is right. You care more about auditing financial spreadsheets than attending country club galas. Brianna understands the social demands of this family better than you do. It will be better for the twins to grow up with a mother who fits in." Brianna smirked, stepping closer to the bassinets. "Do not worry, Sydney. I will make sure the twins go to the best private schools. You can take that money and open a little accounting firm in your old neighborhood." A hot flash of rage burned in my chest, but my mind was completely clear. As a forensic accountant, I spent my entire career dissecting the hidden financial sins of the ultra-wealthy. I knew exactly how Valerie operated. I knew she obsessed over maintaining the image of extreme wealth even when her commercial real estate empire was leveraged to the absolute limit. She thought her money could buy my self-respect. She thought my background made me weak. I reached for the manila folder and pulled out the documents. There was a divorce decree heavily favoring Malcolm and a full custody waiver demanding I surrender all parental rights to my newborn twins. Valerie watched me, expecting me to break down crying or throw a tantrum. That is what a powerless woman would do, but I was not powerless. I calmly pressed the call button on my bed rail. A nurse named Chloe walked in a moment later, looking confused by the crowded room. "Chloe, I need you to witness something for me," I said smoothly. I picked up the custody waiver. I looked directly into Valerie's eyes and ripped the document straight down the middle. I tore it again and again, letting the pieces flutter onto the hospital floor. Valerie gasped, stepping forward with her hand raised, but I held up my pen. However, I continued pulling the divorce papers toward me. "I will gladly sign the dissolution of this marriage." I signed my name on the dotted line of the divorce decree with a steady hand. Then I picked up the bank check for $45 million and folded it neatly, slipping it into the pocket of my robe. Valerie smiled a cold, triumphant smirk, thinking she had just successfully purchased my compliance. "You made the smart choice for once, Sydney." Valerie adjusted her blazer, looking down at me with pure disgust. "The lawyer will process the divorce by tomorrow. Leave the children here. Brianna has already set up the nursery at the estate. We will have security escort you out of the building." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply nodded and asked them to step outside while I gathered my personal belongings. Malcolm looked relieved that the confrontation was over. He turned and walked out the door with Brianna clinging to him, while Valerie gave me one last look of absolute contempt before following them. They thought they had won. They thought they had discarded me, but they severely underestimated the girl from the West End. At midnight, long after the hospital corridors had gone completely quiet, I carried 2 car seats down to the underground parking garage. My trusted security detail, arranged privately days ago, helped me secure my sleeping twins into the back of my black SUV. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. The engine hummed to life in the empty concrete garage. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and opened my secure banking application. I deposited the $45 million check, initiating an immediate priority transfer through my private broker. The screen loaded for exactly 3 seconds before a green confirmation banner appeared. "Clearing of 45 million United States dollars complete." I smiled, staring at the notification. Valerie was so arrogant she had written that check from the master escrow account of her primary holding company. She assumed she could intimidate me into leaving the money untouched until she moved funds around to cover it. But as a forensic accountant, I knew her loan covenants better than she did. Pulling that exact amount of cash out of that specific account triggered an automatic default with Chase Bank. I tapped another button on my screen, sending an automated alert to the clearinghouse. Another message flashed on my phone. "Margin call protocol initiated." Valerie wanted to buy my children. Instead, she had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to legally dismantle her entire empire. I shifted the car into drive and pulled out into the cool Atlanta night, leaving my old life behind and heading straight toward their absolute ruin. The morning sun broke over the sprawling canopy of Buckhead, illuminating the manicured lawns and towering iron gates of the elite. Inside her 20,000 square foot estate, Valerie poured herself a cup of black coffee from a silver carafe. She wore a silk dressing gown, moving with the precise, calculated grace of a woman who believed she owned the city of Atlanta. She had slept perfectly. In her mind, the problem was solved. The West End girl was gone, and the pure bloodline of her family was secured. Valerie walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows of her master suite, looking out over the infinity pool. She despised everything about Sydney. She hated the way Sydney spoke with that quiet, working-class determination. She hated that her son had married a woman who relied on a Spelman degree and relentless hard work instead of pedigree and country club connections. But most of all, Valerie hated that Sydney was smart. But intelligence meant nothing without capital. Valerie picked up her phone and dialed her senior family attorney. "Charles, if we need the custody injunction filed by noon," she said, pacing across the imported marble floor. "Yes, she signed the divorce decree, but she took the infants. I want them back in this house by the end of the week. Have the judge declare her an unfit mother. Make up a narrative about postpartum instability or financial desperation. I do not care how much it costs, just bury her in legal paperwork until she surrenders those children." Charles hesitated on the other end of the line, reminding her that courts frown upon ripping newborns from their mothers without solid financial and legal backing. Valerie scoffed loudly, her arrogance filling the vast room. "Charles Frisch just handed that little nobody a check for $45 million. She took the bait exactly as I predicted. She is probably looking for a cheap house in the suburbs right now. But here is the brilliant part. I wrote that check straight out of the master escrow account for the Midtown Development Project." Charles panicked slightly on the phone, warning her about the severe illegality of mixing personal payoffs with corporate escrow funds. Valerie waved her hand dismissively, even though he could not see her. Do not lecture me on financial compliance, Charles. I built this real estate empire from the ground up when men in this city would not even shake my hand. It is a temporary bridge. The auditors do not look at that specific ledger until the fourth quarter, and we are barely in month 2. By the time anyone notices, I will have shifted the capital from the retail leases to cover the spread. It is my money anyway. Just file the custody papers and let me handle the banking. She ended the call, feeling invincible. She walked toward the grand staircase, planning to wake Malcolm and instruct him on how to handle the media regarding his sudden divorce. She needed to craft a narrative that painted her family as the victims of a gold-digging outsider. But before her foot touched the first velvet-lined step, her phone vibrated in her hand. It was not a text message. It was a high-priority automated alert from Chase Bank. The screen flashed with a bright red notification banner, indicating a massive outgoing wire transfer had been fully processed and cleared. Valerie frowned, adjusting her reading glasses. She tapped the notification, expecting it to be a system error. The banking portal loaded, showing the master escrow account. The balance, which had sat comfortably at over $50 million the day before, was now hovering at a mere $5 million. The $45 million check had not just been deposited. It had bypassed the standard 3-day holding period and cleared instantly. Sydney. Valerie whispered the name like a curse in the empty hallway. How did she clear a check of that magnitude overnight? Then the reality hit her with the force of a physical blow. Sydney was not just a girl from the poor side of Atlanta. She was a forensic accountant who had spent the last 5 years untangling the complex web of Valerie corporate structure. Sydney knew every banking contact, every routing protocol, and every financial loophole in their system. She had authorized the immediate clearance using her own residual administrative access before Valerie had thought to revoke it. Panic, a foreign and unwelcome emotion, began to claw at Valerie's chest. She dialed Malcolm's number, sprinting up the stairs. "Pick up the phone, you useless boy," she hissed. Malcolm answered on the 5th ring, his voice thick with sleep and last night's celebration. "Mother, what is it? Brianna and I are trying to sleep." "Get out of bed!" Valerie screamed, her perfectly composed facade shattering completely. That calculating little rat cashed the check. She bypassed the corporate holding period. She drained the master escrow, Malcolm. "Do you understand what this means?" Malcolm groaned, clearly not grasping the severity of the situation. "So what? Just move the funds from the Buckhead retail accounts like you always do." "Sydney is gone, Mother. We won. Stop worrying and let me sleep." "You absolute fool!" Valerie shouted, pacing frantically in her bedroom. "I cannot move the retail funds because those accounts are tied to the new development loans. If the master escrow stays empty for more than 24 hours, it triggers an automatic audit from the feds. Call the bank. Call your contacts at Chase and tell them to reverse the transaction. Tell them the check was stolen. Tell them anything." Before Malcolm could offer another pathetic excuse, Valerie's private line rang. It was a direct, encrypted number that only her highest-level business associates possessed. She looked at the caller ID. It was Richard Sterling, the regional director of corporate lending at Chase Bank, the man who held the keys to her entire real estate portfolio. Valerie hung up on her son and took a deep breath, forcing her voice into its usual tone of honeyed authority. "Richard, good morning. I was just about to call you. There has been a slight administrative error with one of my accounts, but my team is already handling it." There was no polite greeting on the other end of the line. No deferential small talk that she was accustomed to receiving from the men in the financial district. Richard's voice was entirely professional and completely devoid of warmth. "This is not a social call," Valerie. Richard said, his words clipping through the receiver with surgical precision. "At 6 this morning, our automated compliance system flagged a catastrophic liquidity drain in your master escrow account. The $45 million withdrawal was fully authenticated and authorized by your lead accountant. The funds have been permanently transferred to an external institution." Valerie felt the marble floor seem to drop beneath her feet. "Richard, listen to me. That was a domestic issue. A misunderstanding with my former daughter-in-law. I need you to reverse that wire right now. I will have the funds replenished by the end of the week. I cannot do that, Valerie. The transaction is complete, and the funds are gone. Richard paused, and the silence that followed was heavier than any scream. But that is not why I'm calling you. Valerie gripped the edge of her mahogany dresser, her knuckles turning white. Then why are you calling me Richard? Mrs. Valerie, your escrow balance has dropped below the covenant limit. We are forced to freeze your 5 commercial high-rises. The morning sunlight barely had time to warm the hardwood floors of my secure downtown condo before the heavy, aggressive pounding started at the front door. I had anticipated retaliation, but I did not expect them to find my temporary safe house this quickly. Wrapping my robe tighter around myself, I checked the security monitor. Standing in the hallway was Connor, my sister-in-law Alicia husband, flanked by 2 massive private security guards. Connor was the family-designated financial genius, a man who managed the investment fund and wore his unearned arrogance like a badge of honor. He was a white man who had married into a wealthy black family and somehow managed to treat everyone around him with a thinly veiled superiority. Before I could even decide whether to answer the door, the lock clicked and the heavy wood swung open. Valerie had apparently used her deep pockets to bribe the building management. Connor stepped into the living room, looking around the modest space with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. He brushed a speck of imaginary dust from his expensive tailored suit and offered me a smile that made my skin crawl. "Sydney," he said, shaking his head slowly as if dealing with a stubborn child. "You really thought you could pull a stunt like this and just disappear?" Valerie is furious, and when Valerie is furious, the whole city trembles. But I am here to offer you a way out before things get ugly. I stood perfectly still, placing myself between him and the hallway leading to the bedroom where my twins were sleeping. I did not raise my voice. I just watched him let him get comfortable in his false sense of authority. "You cannot beat Valerie Empire." "Sydney," Connor continued, taking a slow, arrogant step forward while his bodyguards crossed their thick arms. "You are a smart girl. You did well for someone from the West End. But you are out of your depth playing in the deep end of the Buckhead pool. So here is what we are going to do." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a crisp, folded document, tossing it onto my coffee table. "Hand over the kids today. Right now. You sign this updated non-disclosure agreement, and I will personally authorize a wire transfer of $1 extra million into your account. Take the money, Sydney. Go buy a nice little house back in your old neighborhood. Live quietly with your kind of people. Do not try to fight a war you are entirely unequipped to survive." The room went dead silent. The casual, subtle racism dripping from his words was not new. Connor had always viewed me as the hired help masquerading as family. He thought my historically black college education made me naive. He thought my working-class background made me desperate for a quick payout. He assumed I was just a calculator in a skirt. I looked at the paper on the table, then back at his smug, confident face. I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make his bodyguards shift uncomfortably on their feet. "Connor," I said, keeping my tone conversational and remarkably calm. "When you married into this family, you assumed you were the smartest person in the room. You assumed that managing the family investment portfolio gave you untouchable power. But you forgot what my actual profession is. I am a forensic accountant. My entire job is to find the rot hiding beneath expensive suits and fake smiles." I walked slowly over to my kitchen counter, completely ignoring his bodyguards. I opened my leather work bag and pulled out a thick red dossier. It was heavy, packed with weeks of sleepless nights and meticulous auditing. I walked back and dropped the red folder right on top of his insulting contract. The sharp slap of paper hitting the wood made Connor flinch. "What is this?" he asked, his smug smile faltering slightly as he stared at the bright red cover. "That," I said, taking a step closer to him, "is the end of your freedom. While you and Valerie were busy treating me like trash, I was auditing every single financial entity connected to the family trust, including the philanthropic branch you manage. You know the one. the charity fund set up to support the local Black churches and community outreach programs across Atlanta. Connor's face lost a fraction of its color, his jaw tightened. I do not know what kind of fabricated garbage you put in there, but you are bluffing. Open it, I challenged him, my voice dropping to an icy whisper. Open it and look at page 4. Look at the $12 million you quietly siphoned out of the community church charity fund over the last 3 years. You thought routing it through 6 different shell companies in Delaware would hide the paper trail. You thought nobody would notice the inflated invoice payments to phantom construction firms. But you made one fatal mistake, Connor. You transferred the final consolidated sum into a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands that is registered under your mother's maiden name. The silence in the condo was deafening now. The 2 bodyguards exchanged a quick, confused glance, suddenly realizing they had walked into a much more dangerous situation than a simple family dispute. Connor staggered back a step, as if I had physically struck him. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The arrogant savior complex melted away instantly, leaving behind a terrified, greedy coward. You have no proof, he stammered, a bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead. That money was legally invested for tax mitigation purposes. It is completely standard practice. Tax mitigation. I laughed, a sharp, cold sound that echoed off the walls. That is a very creative way to pronounce federal embezzlement. $12 million stolen from a church fund in Atlanta and funneled offshore by a wealthy white fund manager. How do you think that headline will play on the evening news, Connor? How do you think Valerie will react when she finds out you have been robbing the family blind while she was busy worrying about my bloodline? I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, tapping the screen until it woke up. I held the device up so he could clearly see the screen. On the display was a drafted email containing a secure link to the entire red dossier. The recipient lines were already filled out. One address belonged to the white-collar crime division of the FBI. The other belonged to Reverend Thomas, the highly respected head pastor of the church he had stolen from. I give you exactly 30 seconds to get out of my face, I said, my voice hard and absolute. 30 seconds to take your bodyguards and run before I hit send on this email and trigger a federal investigation that will end with you in a concrete cell. Connor stared at the phone screen, his eyes wide with pure, undisguised panic. He looked at the red dossier on the table, then back at me. All his supposed superiority was completely gone. He was trembling. Sydney, please, he choked out, taking a desperate step toward me. We can work this out. I can cut you in. I can give you whatever you want. 20 seconds, I replied, my thumb hovering directly over the send button. The bodyguards did not wait for him. Recognizing a sinking ship when they saw one, the 2 massive men turned on their heels and walked out the open front door, leaving their employer completely defenseless. Connor let out a pathetic sound caught between a sob and a gasp. He scrambled backward, nearly tripping over the rug as he bolted for the hallway. The heavy front door slammed shut behind him, echoing with the sound of his total defeat. I stood alone in the quiet living room, lowering my phone. The threat was neutralized for now, but the game was far from over. Connor was a coward, but Valerie was a monster, and she was not going to stop trying to destroy me. I walked over to the window and looked down at the street below, watching Connor sprint toward his luxury sedan like a hunted animal. I smiled as I watched him drive away erratically. The family was beginning to tear itself apart from the inside out, and they still had no idea what was coming next. I picked up the red dossier and placed it safely back into my bag. It was time to let the high society of Atlanta see exactly what kind of people they had been worshipping. I checked the time on my phone. Valerie's grand engagement party at the country club was starting in less than 6 hours, and I fully intended to be the center of attention. Valerie was hemorrhaging cash from every corporate artery, but her instinct was not to panic privately. Her instinct was to throw a party. The Buckhead Heritage Country Club was the undisputed crown jewel of Atlanta's high society. Booking the grand ballroom on a Saturday night cost a fortune that Valerie no longer possessed, but she needed to project an image of absolute invincibility to her nervous investors. Rumors were already swirling through the country club locker rooms about Chase Bank freezing her commercial assets. She needed a loud and shiny distraction. More importantly, she wanted to publicly replace me and rewrite the narrative of her son's sudden divorce before the ink on the paperwork was even dry. The ballroom was practically dripping in imported white orchids and cascading crystal. A live string quartet played softly in the corner, while waiters in immaculate tuxedos circulated the room with silver trays of vintage champagne. Valerie stood near the center of the room, wearing a custom emerald gown holding court among the city's most influential developers and politicians. Right beside her was Malcolm, looking slightly pale and entirely out of his depth. Clinging tightly to Malcolm's arm was Brianna. Brianna was soaking up the attention like a parched sponge. She wore a white silk dress that was entirely too bridal for an engagement party, and she kept lifting her left hand to ensure the massive cushion-cut diamond caught the light of the overhead chandeliers. She laughed loudly at jokes she did not understand, and nodded eagerly at older wealthy women who were secretly judging her cheap hair extensions and desperate energy. "Look at her," Valerie said loudly enough for a group of prominent real estate investors to hear over the music. "Brianna is such a breath of fresh air. She is so elegant and devoted to family. Malcolm is finally with a woman who understands the social responsibilities of our world. It is just a profound relief to be rid of the previous baggage." The investors offered polite, tight-lipped smiles. They all knew me. I had audited half of their portfolios. They knew exactly who was keeping Valerie's empire afloat behind the scenes while Malcolm played golf. I timed my entrance perfectly. I did not sneak through the side doors or use an old membership card to bypass the front desk. I walked through the main double doors of the grand ballroom wearing a backless crimson gown that turned every single head in the room. The string quartet actually seemed to miss a note. Conversation simply stopped. The sea of expensive suits and designer dresses parted as I walked confidently across the polished marble floor. Valerie's face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. The champagne glass in her hand shook so violently the liquid spilled over the crystal rim. She whispered something urgent to Malcolm, who immediately looked like he wanted to crawl under the nearest table and disappear. "Security?" Valerie shouted, her voice breaking the refined quiet of the room. "Get security in here right now! This woman is no longer a member and she is trespassing on a private event." Two burly security guards in dark suits started walking toward me from the lobby entrance. But before they could reach me, a booming voice echoed over the microphone on the main stage. "Stand down, gentlemen," the voice commanded. It was Richard Sterling, the president of the country club, and coincidentally, the regional director of Chase Bank. The very same man who had frozen Valerie's accounts that morning. He stepped down from the stage and walked directly over to me, offering his arm like a perfect gentleman. "Sydney is not trespassing," Valerie, Richard said, his voice projecting across the silent ballroom. "She is my personal guest of honor tonight. As many of you know, Sydney recently launched her own independent forensic accounting firm. She has graciously agreed to oversee the financial restructuring of this very country club. We are incredibly lucky to have her with us." A ripple of shock waved through the wealthy crowd. Valerie's mouth hung open. Her power in this room relied entirely on the illusion of her wealth and influence. Richard publicly honoring me over her was the ultimate social execution. Brianna, however, was not smart enough to read the room. Fueled by several glasses of champagne and the false security of her new diamond ring, she let go of Malcolm's arm and marched directly toward me. She stopped inches from my face, sneering as she looked me up and down. "You just could not stay away." "Could you, Sydney?" Brianna said, her voice loud and abrasive. "You are so desperate for attention. You lost your husband, you lost your money, and now you are crashing my engagement party just to feel relevant. Why do you not do us all a favor and go back to the ghetto? Malcolm is mine now." I did not flinch. I simply smiled warmly at her. "Brianna," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and remarkably pleasant, "you are absolutely right. Malcolm is entirely yours. But before you celebrate too much, you really should learn how to secure your digital devices. When you sleep with a married man and use his iPad to log into your personal accounts, you should always remember to sign out. The iCloud syncs everything automatically across all registered devices. Brianna frowned, her arrogant confidence wavering for a fraction of a second. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. I turned toward the audio-visual technician standing near the stage. I gave him a small nod. Earlier that afternoon, I had provided him with a flash drive under the guise of presenting financial projections for the club's board members. The massive projector screen behind the stage flickered to life. The country club logo disappeared and was replaced by a highly detailed financial spreadsheet. The crowd gasped as the numbers lit up the dark room. "Since you are joining a family that values transparency, I thought the investors here tonight should know exactly who they are dealing with," I announced, my voice carrying clearly without a microphone. On the screen was Brianna's complete credit history. It showed maxed-out credit cards, defaulting personal loans, and 3 separate accounts in active collections. The total debt hovered just over $120,000. Valerie stared at the screen in absolute horror. She had just spent the last hour introducing this girl as a high society heiress to the most powerful people in the state. "You are completely broke, Brianna," I said, looking back at her pale face. "You targeted my husband because you are drowning in debt and you needed a quick payout. You thought the $45 million check would clear all your problems. Sadly, Valerie has zero liquidity and Malcolm does not have a single dime to his name that I do not legally control." "That is illegal!" Brianna screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. "You cannot show my private information. Malcolm, do something." Malcolm took a step forward, but I raised my hand to stop him. "Oh, I am not finished, Malcolm," I said. "This next part is actually just for you." I tapped a button on a small remote in my hand. The slide on the massive screen changed. The financial documents vanished and were replaced by a clear, high-resolution medical file. It was an ultrasound image complete with a date and patient name printed clearly in the top corner. Brianna Davis. The entire ballroom inhaled a collective breath. "You see, Malcolm?" I continued, looking directly into my former husband's terrified eyes. "Brianna told you she was pregnant with your child. That is why you rushed to sign those divorce papers in the hospital. That is why you let your mother hand her my designer bag. You thought you were starting a brand new family." I pointed at the date on the medical file displayed on the 20-foot screen. "But according to this ultrasound taken at a clinic in Midtown 3 days ago, Brianna is exactly 14 weeks pregnant." I paused, letting the harsh mathematical reality settle over the silent room. "Malcolm, you hired her as your assistant exactly 10 weeks ago. You two started your pathetic little affair 8 weeks ago." Malcolm's face drained of all color. He stared at the screen, his eyes wide with terrible realization. He slowly turned his head to look at Brianna. Brianna was physically shaking. She clutched her stomach, stepping backward. "Malcolm, I can explain," she stammered, her voice pitching into a panicked whine. "It is a mistake. The machine was wrong. Machines do not lie, Brianna," I said, my voice cutting through her weak excuses like a blade. "Numbers do not lie. And timelines certainly do not lie. You found a gullible rich man to pay off your massive debts and raise another man's child." Valerie let out a sound that was half gasp and half shriek. She grabbed the edge of a cocktail table to keep from collapsing to the floor. The elite guests of Buckhead were practically vibrating with the scandal, whispering behind their crystal champagne flutes. The pristine reputation Valerie had spent 40 years building was currently burning to the ground in front of her most important peers. I looked at the 3 of them standing there, completely ruined by their own arrogance and deceit. "Congratulations on your engagement, Malcolm," I said, projecting my voice so every single person in the grand ballroom could hear my final words. "I hope you and Brianna have a beautiful life together." I turned my back on them and walked gracefully toward the president's table, leaving my former family drowning in a sea of public humiliation and absolute destruction. I took my seat next to Richard Sterling at the president table, deliberately turning my attention back to the string quartet, as if the ballroom behind me was not descending into absolute madness. It took exactly 4 seconds for Malcolm to fully process the basic mathematics I had just projected onto the massive 20-foot screen. 14 weeks pregnant. 8 weeks of sleeping together. The pampered golden child of Buckhead had just been played for an absolute fool in front of every major investor in the city. The heavy silence in the room shattered when Malcolm let out a sound that was half scream and half sob. He lunged across the polished marble floor, closing the distance between himself and Brianna in 3 long, angry strides. He grabbed her by the arm, spinning her around so roughly that her crystal champagne flute slipped from her hand and shattered against the floor. The sound of breaking glass echoed sharply, but not a single waiter moved to clean it up. "Whose is it?" Malcolm shouted, his voice cracking as his carefully manicured corporate image dissolved completely. "Tell me whose baby you are actually carrying, Brianna." Brianna tried to pull away, her face flushed with intense panic and deep humiliation. She looked around the crowded room, begging silently for someone to intervene, but the wealthy politicians and real estate moguls just watched her with cold, detached curiosity. "It is yours, Malcolm," she pleaded, desperately clinging to the satin lapels of his custom-tailored tuxedo. "The ultrasound technician made a mistake. They measure the weeks wrong all the time. You have to believe me." But Malcolm was not listening anymore. He shoved her backward and she stumbled heavily, tripping over the hem of her highly inappropriate white silk dress. Valerie, who had been frozen in sheer shock by a nearby cocktail table, finally snapped. The public humiliation of her precious son was vastly more than her fragile aristocratic pride could bear. She marched over to Brianna, her heavy emerald gown sweeping across the scattered broken glass. Without a single word of warning, Valerie raised her hand and struck Brianna across the face. The slap echoed through the grand ballroom like a gunshot. Brianna gasped, clutching her reddened cheek as tears of genuine shock spilled over her heavy evening makeup. "You pathetic little gold digger," Valerie hissed, her voice vibrating with pure, unadulterated aristocratic rage. "You actually thought you could trap my son and siphon off my family fortune. Get out of my country club before I have you arrested for fraud." Brianna turned and ran, pushing her way through the heavy oak double doors and leaving her shredded dignity behind on the ballroom floor. But Valerie was far from finished. Her chest heaved as she pivoted slowly, her furious gaze locking directly onto me where I sat comfortably sipping my vintage champagne. In her arrogant mind, I was the sole architect of this disaster. I had pulled the heavy curtain back and exposed the ugly truth she had tried so desperately to bury. She stormed across the room, completely ignoring the shocked whispers of her elite peers, and stopped mere inches from my table. "You think this is a game, Sydney?" she screamed, slamming both of her hands flat against the white linen tablecloth. "You think you can walk into my world project, my family private business, on a screen and leave without consequences? I will crush you with my wealth." I did not even blink. I set my champagne glass down and looked up at her, maintaining my completely unbothered expression. Valerie was shaking with a rage so profound it made her jaw tremble uncontrollably. "You took my $45 million check and you thought you won?" she continued, spit flying from her lips. "But you forgot exactly who I am. I am Valerie Sterling. I own half the commercial real estate in this city. I am calling Chase Bank right now, and I am canceling that check. I will claim you stole it from my office. I will freeze your meager assets. I will bury you in so much litigation you will never see the light of day again. You will be back in the West End begging for food by the end of the week." She reached into her designer emerald clutch and pulled out her phone, her fingers jabbing aggressively at the screen. I waited patiently until she held the phone to her ear before I finally decided to speak. I raised my champagne glass, slightly catching the warm light of the chandeliers. "How exactly do you plan to cancel a check from a completely empty account, Valerie? I asked, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal clarity. Valerie froze, the phone still pressed tightly to her ear. What did you just say? She demanded. I smiled, looking over at Richard, who sat silently beside me, watching the financial empire he had helped build crumble. The bank just notified you of zero liquidity this morning, I reminded her. Did you honestly think I simply deposited that money into a standard savings account to gather interest? I am a forensic accountant, Valerie. I do not save money. I use it as leverage. The phone slipped from Valerie's ear as the horrifying realization began to dawn on her. I stood up, smoothing the skirt of my crimson dress. Your master escrow account was the only collateral holding up the massive loans on your 5 commercial high-rises, I explained, speaking slowly so the surrounding investors could hear every single devastating word. When you gave me that $45 million, you instantly triggered a margin call. Your lenders panicked. They started selling off your distressed debt at a fraction of its value just to mitigate their massive losses. And since I happened to have $45 million in perfectly cleared liquid cash waiting in my private brokerage account, I bought it all. Valerie staggered backward, clutching her chest as if she could no longer breathe the conditioned air. I bought out your debt, Valerie, I said, stepping closer to her to deliver the final blow. I did not just take your money. I used your own cash to quietly buy the loans that control your commercial properties. You do not own those high-rises anymore. I do. You are completely and utterly bankrupt. You tried to buy my newborn twins, but all you actually did was hand me the master keys to your entire empire. The brutal reality of her total financial ruin hit Valerie so hard her knees literally buckled beneath her. She collapsed heavily into a chair, gasping for air, while the elite crowd murmured in collective shock. Suddenly, a heavy weight hit the floor right beside me. It was Malcolm. He had just witnessed his mother's entire empire evaporate and his mistress flee, all in the span of 10 minutes. He dropped to his knees right in front of me, grabbing the hem of my dress with trembling, desperate hands. "Sydney, please." He begged, tears streaming down his face, ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. I was wrong. I was so stupid. She tricked me, Sydney. I did not want any of this. We can fix this right now. We can go home and be a family again. You, me, and the twins. I love you, Sydney. Please forgive me. I looked down at the pathetic man I had once loved, the man who had stood by silently while his mother threw a check in my face to buy my children. I felt absolutely nothing for him anymore. I reached down and calmly peeled his fingers off the fabric of my dress, brushing him away like unwanted lint. I do not think so, Malcolm, I said, stepping back and looking down at him with icy indifference. You see, my lawyer officially filed the divorce papers with the court this morning, the exact same papers you so eagerly rushed to sign in my hospital room yesterday when you thought you were trading me in for a younger model. Congratulations, Malcolm. You are officially single and completely broke. The morning sun offered no warmth as it filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling corporate headquarters in downtown Atlanta. The top-floor suite, usually a sanctuary of power and intimidation, now felt like a glass cage. Malcolm paced the length of the room, his tie undone, his eyes bloodshot from a night spent drinking and panicking. Valerie sat behind the massive mahogany desk, staring blindly at a rapidly dropping graph on her computer monitor. The silence in the office was suffocating, broken only by the incessant ringing of the multi-line phone system that Valerie refused to answer. How could you let this happen? Malcolm finally snapped, whirling around to face his mother. How could you let her touch our financial records? You knew she was a forensic accountant. You knew she could trace every single penny, and you just handed her the keys to the kingdom. Valerie rubbed her temples, her perfectly manicured nails pressing hard into her skin. I brought her in because we needed someone we could control. She fired back, her voice losing its usual aristocratic polish. She was your wife, Malcolm. I assumed you had her on a tight leash. I assumed she would fix the discrepancies quietly and keep her mouth shut out of loyalty to the family name. Loyalty! Malcolm laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. You pushed her out. You practically forced me to sign those divorce papers and hand her designer bag to a girl who lied about being pregnant. You humiliated her, Valerie, and now she owns us. He slumped into a leather chair, burying his face in his hands. I do not even know how to run this company, he muttered, his voice dropping to a pathetic whisper. I never did. It was the undeniable truth that the entire Sterling family had spent half a decade desperately trying to ignore. For 5 years, Malcolm had played the role of the visionary real estate tycoon. He attended the ribbon-cutting ceremonies, he gave interviews to business magazines, and he spent 3 days a week on the golf course entertaining local politicians. But he was nothing more than an empty figurehead wearing a very expensive suit. Every successful project, every corporate acquisition, every financial crisis averted over the last 5 years was entirely because of me. While Malcolm was out taking the credit and posing for photographs, I was the one pulling sleepless nights in the home office. I was the one scrubbing the spreadsheets, finding the hidden tax loopholes and restructuring their toxic debt to keep the Sterling Empire from collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance. Whenever a deal was about to go south, Valerie would quietly dump the files on my desk, and I would spend 48 hours straight salvaging their careless mistakes. Valerie knew exactly how incompetent her son was. Richard knew it too. But they let Malcolm believe he was a financial genius because it fit the perfect family narrative they sold to the public. They needed the world to see the Sterling men as invincible. And now the invisible safety net they had taken for granted was completely gone. The phones kept ringing, echoing endlessly through the massive suite. The fallout from the country club gala had been swift and absolutely brutal. Atlanta high society thrives on gossip, and the story of the Sterling family public execution had spread through the city elite before the midnight champagne was even poured. The corporate shareholders smelled blood in the water. They had seen the sheer panic on Valerie's face last night, and they knew the rumors about Chase Bank freezing their assets were completely true. Valerie refreshed her computer screen and let out a strangled gasp. The company stock was tanking. It was a complete free-fall. Investors were dumping their shares at an unprecedented rate, desperately trying to distance themselves from a sinking ship. Decades of carefully cultivated trust evaporated in a matter of hours. We have to release a statement, Valerie said, her hands trembling as she reached for her desk phone. We have to tell the board this is a temporary liquidity issue caused by a disgruntled former family member. We can spin this, Malcolm. We just need to control the narrative like we always do. There is no narrative left to control, Mother, Malcolm yelled, jumping out of his chair and slamming his hands on the desk. Sydney did not just freeze our accounts, she bought our debt. She holds the commercial loans on all 5 of our high-rises. We are entirely at her mercy, and you are still worried about a press release. Before Valerie could formulate another desperate lie, the heavy glass doors to the executive suite swung open. Neither of them had authorized any visitors. Standing in the doorway was a team of 3 corporate lawyers wearing identical gray suits and carrying thick leather briefcases. Leading them was Robert Carmichael, the senior managing partner for Chase Bank Corporate Division. Robert did not offer a polite greeting. He did not even acknowledge Malcolm. He walked directly to Valerie's desk and dropped a massive stack of legal documents right on top of her keyboard. The heavy thud made both Malcolm and Valerie jump in their seats. What is the meaning of this? Valerie demanded, trying to summon her usual terrifying authority, but her voice cracked with panic. You cannot just barge into my office, Robert. You do not have an office anymore, Valerie, Robert said, his tone completely devoid of emotion. As of 9:00 this morning, Chase Bank has officially declared your accounts in total default. The margin call triggered last night has accelerated the restructuring protocol. Your credit lines are completely severed. Malcolm stepped forward, his face pale and covered in a cold sweat. We just need a little time, Robert. We can liquidate some of the residential properties. We can restructure the portfolio by the end of the week. Robert turned to Malcolm with a look of profound pity mixed with absolute disgust. There is no portfolio left to restructure, Malcolm. The independent entity that purchased your distressed commercial debt last night has formally requested immediate repayment in full. The shareholders have filed an emergency injunction to halt all operations. You are both being removed from the board effective immediately pending a full federal audit of your philanthropic accounts. Valerie collapsed back into her chair, clutching her chest as the reality of her total destruction finally settled in. You cannot do this, she wheezed, her manicured hands gripping the leather armrests. We built this city. We are the Sterlings. Names do not pay debts, Valerie Robert replied, adjusting his briefcase with brutal calm. The bank is delivering a final ultimatum. You have exactly 72 hours to secure and transfer $200 million in liquid capital. If that money is not in our holding account by the deadline, we are initiating a total foreclosure on every single asset associated with the Sterling name. The commercial properties, the residential estates, the country club shares, even the cars you drove here this morning. Everything will be seized and liquidated to satisfy your creditors. 72 hours? Malcolm repeated, his voice barely a whisper. That is impossible. Nobody can secure $200 million in 3 days. We are finished. Robert turned and walked toward the door, his legal team following silently behind him. I strongly suggest you start packing your personal items, Robert said, pausing briefly at the threshold. And you might want to call your former daughter-in-law. She is the only person in Atlanta who currently has the power to stop this. The glass doors clicked shut, leaving Malcolm and Valerie completely alone in the silent office. The empire had officially fallen. The undertow had finally caught them, and they were drowning with absolutely no one left to save them. I barely had time to pour myself a fresh cup of coffee when my phone began to vibrate on the granite kitchen island. The caller ID flashed a name I had not expected to see so soon. Alicia, Malcolm's sister and the incredibly compliant wife of Connor. The only biological daughter of the Sterling dynasty who had spent her entire life trying to be the perfect high society princess. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my thumb across the screen. Sydney, please do not hang up. Alicia practically sobbed into the receiver. Her voice was thick and raspy, stripped of its usual polished finishing school perfection. You have to stop this. Mom is hyperventilating in the home office and Malcolm is catatonic. You are destroying everything our family built. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the dark roast warm my throat. I did not build anything with your family, Alicia, I said, keeping my tone even and completely detached. I was just the hired help. Remember, the accountant you all expected to clean up your messes while you hosted charity galas. But we are family, Sydney, she cried, a desperate edge to her voice. Black excellence means sticking together. You know how hard Mom worked to establish our name in Atlanta? You cannot just tear down generations of legacy because Malcolm made a mistake. Family is supposed to mean family over everything. We forgive each other. We protect each other. The sheer audacity of her words hung in the quiet air of my condo. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the city skyline. The Sterling high-rises stood in the distance, towers of glass and steel that I now effectively controlled. Family over everything! I repeated the phrase, tasting bitter on my tongue. Is that what your mother told you to say when she handed you the phone? Is that the script Valerie wrote for you? Because from where I am standing, the Sterling family only protects its own image. They do not protect people, Alicia. They consume them. Sydney. That is not true. She pleaded, her breath hitching. Mom loves us. She just wants to protect the legacy. Protect the legacy, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper. Like how she protected your legacy during your sophomore year at Spelman. The line went dead silent. I could hear the faint sound of Alicia breathing sharp, ragged little gasps of air. You think your family's secrets are actually secret? Alicia, I continued, pressing the advantage. I spent 5 years untangling Valerie offshore accounts and private expenditures. I know exactly where the money went. I know about the $50,000 payment to the private clinic in Switzerland. I know she forced you to board a plane and terminate a pregnancy you desperately wanted to keep just because the father was a working-class boy who did not fit the pristine, sterling family narrative. She traded your first child to save her country club reputation. A broken sob echoed through the phone. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak. You were 20 years old. Alicia, I said, my tone softening just a fraction. You begged her to let you keep the baby, but Valerie told you it would ruin the family image. She told you that you were a disappointment. And then she paraded you around the following spring in a custom gown to announce your arranged engagement to Connor, a man who does not even respect you. A man who came to my home yesterday and tried to bribe me while funneling $12 million of church charity funds into his own offshore accounts. Alicia let out a sharp gasp. What did you just say about Connor? He is a thief, Alicia. Your mother is a monster. Your brother is a coward. And your husband is a criminal who uses your family name to steal from the very community you claim to protect. They have all been using you as a prop in their perfect family picture. You are the good daughter, the compliant wife, the beautiful accessory. But they do not respect you. They have never respected you. The silence that followed was different this time. It was not the silence of shock. It was the heavy, terrifying silence of an illusion completely shattering. I could almost hear the carefully constructed walls of her reality crumbling to dust. All my life she whispered, her voice sounding hollow and completely empty. I did everything she ever asked me to do. I smiled. I wore the right clothes. I married the man she chose for me. I gave up everything. I gave up my baby. She traded your soul for a country club membership, Alicia. And now she is asking you to beg the woman she threw away to save the empire she built on your pain. A long, agonizing minute passed. The sound of Alicia crying stopped completely. When she finally spoke again, her voice was unrecognizable. It was stripped of all its former weakness and filled with a cold, calculating rage that rivaled Valerie herself. What do you need, Sydney? The question was simple, but it changed the entire trajectory of the war. The good daughter had finally snapped. The resentment that had been festering inside her for over a decade had just boiled over and consumed her loyalty. I need the black box, I said without hesitation. Every major financial dynasty has a digital black box, an encrypted offshore server holding the unedited, unscrubbed ledgers, the shadow books that forensic accountants are never allowed to see. I knew Valerie had one. I just never had the access codes. My phone buzzed against my ear. I pulled it away and looked at the screen. A text message from Alicia had just come through. It contained an IP address, a secure server portal link, and a string of complex alphanumeric passcodes. Connor keeps the master codes on a hidden drive in his home office safe, Alicia said, her voice frighteningly calm. He thinks I do not know the combination. He thinks I am too stupid to understand what those numbers mean. Burn it down, Sydney. Burn the whole damn thing to the ground. The line clicked dead. I stared at the screen, watching the master passcodes glow against the dark background. Alicia had just handed me the ultimate weapon. Valerie thought she was fighting a war over commercial real estate and frozen bank accounts. But with the digital black box, I was about to expose the darkest financial crimes the Sterling family had ever committed. The federal government was going to tear them apart piece by piece, and the daughter Valerie had sacrificed to save her image had just struck the fatal blow. Connor did not know about the phone call between his wife and me, but he was not stupid enough to believe the sudden silence from his mother-in-law meant everything was fine. It was past 2 in the morning and his home office looked like the site of a natural disaster. Desk drawers were yanked open and thrown onto the expensive Persian rug. Manila folders and shredded bank statements covered every inch of available floor space. Connor was sweating profusely, his silk tie discarded somewhere in the hallway, and the top buttons of his tailored shirt ripped open. His hands shook violently as he punched the combination into the hidden wall safe behind his mahogany bookshelf. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open, revealing neatly stacked bundles of $100 bills, a velvet pouch of gold Krugerrands, and 3 different passports. He grabbed a large leather duffel bag and began frantically shoveling the assets inside. His breathing was shallow and rapid. On his desk, his laptop screen cast a pale blue glow over the chaos, displaying a confirmed first-class one-way ticket to Zurich, departing at 6 in the morning. He had spent the last 4 hours trying to reach Valerie. He had called her private line, her cell phone, even the encrypted burner phone they used for their most sensitive offshore transactions. Every single call went straight to voicemail. The sheer terror of that silence had driven him to this panicked midnight packing. If Valerie was not answering, it meant she was already talking to lawyers preparing to shift the blame, or worse, she had already been raided. Connor knew exactly how the philanthropic embezzlement looked on paper, and he knew that as the white son-in-law managing the accounts, he was the absolute perfect scapegoat for a wealthy black family looking to protect their dynastic image. He zipped the heavy duffel bag shut, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the leather handles. He would leave Alicia sleeping in the master bedroom. He did not even consider waking her. She was just a prop to him anyway, a biological key that had unlocked the vault to the Sterling Empire. He would be over the Atlantic before she even realized he was missing. Connor grabbed his laptop and moved toward the office door, but froze when he heard it. It was not the soft chime of the front gate or the polite ring of the doorbell. It was a heavy, aggressive pounding that physically shook the heavy oak of the front door. It was the kind of knock that did not ask for permission to enter. Connor dropped the duffel bag, his heart slamming against his ribs like a trapped bird. He crept out of the office and walked silently down the grand curved staircase, staying close to the wall so he would not be seen through the massive foyer windows. The pounding came again, louder this time, followed by a voice that shattered the quiet suburban night. Federal Bureau of Investigation opened the door. Connor felt his stomach drop to the floor. The air in his lungs vanished. He stood paralyzed on the bottom step, staring at the front door as the heavy brass handle began to rattle. He knew they would not hesitate to break it down. With trembling legs, he walked across the marble foyer and slowly turned the deadbolt. The door was immediately pushed open, forcing Connor to stumble backward. 4 agents pushed their way into the house wearing dark tactical jackets with FBI emblazoned across the back in bright yellow letters. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face carved from granite, stepped right up to Connor, holding up a thick stack of folded papers. "Connor Sterling," the agent stated, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, grand larceny, and federal embezzlement. We also have a search warrant for this property, including your home office and all digital devices. You cannot do this." Connor stammered, backing away as 2 agents moved past him and headed straight up the stairs toward his office. "I want to call my lawyer. You have no right to barge in here. Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the lead agent commanded, completely ignoring Connor. Weak protests. As the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists, Connor lost whatever was left of his arrogant composure. The reality of concrete cells and federal prison uniforms crashed down on him. His breathing turned into hyperventilation and his face twisted into an ugly mask of panic and rage. "This is her fault," he screamed, spit flying from his mouth as the agent forcefully turned him toward the door. "Sydney set me up. She hacked my accounts. She is a disgruntled ex-family member trying to ruin us because her husband left her. You have the wrong person. She is the one who fabricated those ledgers. She is the one who called you." The lead agent paused, gripping Connor by the bicep. He looked at the sweating, terrified man with a mixture of professional exhaustion and deep pity. "I do not know who Sydney is, Mr. Sterling," the agent said, his voice deadpan. "And we did not receive any anonymous hacks or fabricated ledgers." Connor stopped, struggling. The confusion cut through his panic for a split second. "What are you talking about?" he choked out. "If Sydney did not call you, then who did?" The agent pushed Connor forward toward the flashing red and blue lights of the SUVs parked in his circular driveway. "We received the tip-off and the primary evidence directly from your mother-in-law, Valerie Sterling," the agent said casually. She walked into our field office 3 hours ago with her entire legal team. She handed over the offshore account numbers, the fake church invoices, and sworn affidavits claiming you acted entirely alone to defraud her family charity. Connor legs completely gave out. If the agent had not been holding him up, he would have collapsed onto the pristine brick walkway. Valerie had not been avoiding his calls because she was panicking. She had been ignoring him because she was busy throwing him to the wolves. She had taken the digital evidence I had threatened them with and spun it to make Connor the sole mastermind. The mighty Valerie Sterling had sacrificed her arrogant white son-in-law to the federal government without a second thought, just to save her own skin and buy herself enough time to restructure her failing empire. Valerie had thrown her own son-in-law to the wolves, but federal investigations take time, and she knew she needed immediate leverage. She had lost her buildings, she had lost her fortune, and she was rapidly losing her freedom. But in her twisted, aristocratic mind, she believed she still had one final trump card to play against me: my newborn twins. Less than 48 hours after the FBI dragged Connor out of his mansion in handcuffs, I was served with emergency custody papers. Valerie had called in her last remaining political favors to fast-track a hearing with a family court judge she had practically bought and paid for over the last decade. The petition was a masterpiece of malicious fiction. It claimed I was suffering from severe postpartum psychosis, that I was a danger to myself and my children, and that the Sterling family needed to assume immediate protective custody of the infants. I walked into the oak-paneled courtroom the following morning feeling a calm that frankly terrified my own legal counsel. Valerie was already seated at the petitioner table, looking every bit the grieving, concerned grandmother. She wore a conservative black suit, her posture rigid and practiced. Malcolm sat beside her, looking hollow and completely lost, still wearing a wrinkled shirt from 2 days ago. He was just a puppet now, completely drained of his arrogant swagger. Valerie had assembled a team of 3 aggressive family law attorneys who looked at me like a lamb ready for the slaughter. The judge, a gray-haired man with a heavy scowl, adjusted his glasses and immediately began reciting. Valerie fabricated claims, noting my recent extreme financial maneuvers as evidence of my supposed mental instability. Valerie shot me a subtle, smug look across the aisle. She actually thought she had backed me into a corner. She thought the threat of taking my babies would force me to sign back her commercial properties. I leaned back in my chair and gave my attorney a simple nod. He stood up, opening a sleek leather folder, and approached the bench. He did not present character witnesses or medical evaluations to dispute Valerie's ridiculous claims of my insanity. Instead, he slid a single legally binding document across the polished wood to the judge. It was the divorce agreement. The exact same divorce agreement that Malcolm had so eagerly signed in my hospital room when he thought he was upgrading to a younger pregnant mistress and leaving me with nothing. The judge frowned, scanning the pages before looking down at Valerie's expensive legal team. Valerie shifted in her seat, her smug expression faltering slightly as the judge flipped to the final page of the document. "Your Honor," my attorney said, his voice echoing clearly through the silent courtroom, "the petitioner has absolutely no legal standing to file for emergency custody or any custody at all." Valerie stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "That is absurd," she snapped, dropping her sweet grandmother act instantly. "Those children carry the Sterling bloodline." My attorney smiled, a cold, clinical smile that mirrored my own. He pointed to the document in the judge's hand. 5 years ago, Valerie Sterling personally instructed her corporate lawyers to draft a universal, ironclad prenuptial and divorce agreement to protect the Sterling estate from potential gold diggers. The clause she insisted on adding was very specific. The judge adjusted his glasses and read the highlighted text out loud for the entire courtroom to hear. Section 4, paragraph 9, states that upon the execution of this divorce agreement, the signatory male completely and permanently waives all legal, financial, and physical rights to any offspring conceived during the marriage. The signatory formally relinquishes all claims of paternity to protect the Sterling family trust from future child support litigation. The words hung in the air, heavy and devastating. Valerie had written that clause herself years ago, terrified that some woman would trap Malcolm with a baby and demand a slice of her empire. She had been so obsessed with protecting her money from imaginary threats that she had legally severed her own son from his children. And Malcolm, in his rush to leave me for Brianna, had blindly signed away his rights without reading a single word of his mother's ironclad trap. The realization hit the petitioner table like a physical blow. Malcolm stared at the document in horror, finally understanding what his arrogance had cost him. Valerie's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Her own paranoid greed had just been weaponized against her. The judge looked at the Sterling family with pure disgust, disgusted that he had risked his own reputation for a family that did not even have basic legal standing to be in his courtroom. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block. This petition is entirely baseless and borders on harassment. The judge declared, his voice booming. Case dismissed with prejudice. The loud crack of the gavel echoed like a gunshot. Valerie swayed on her feet, her face turning an alarming shade of gray. Her empire was gone, her son was broken, her son-in-law was facing federal prison, and her final desperate attempt to steal my children had ended in complete humiliation. She let out a sharp, shallow gasp, grasping blindly at the edge of the heavy wooden table, before her eyes rolled back and she collapsed heavily onto the courtroom floor. The cold linoleum floor of the courtroom was the last thing Valerie Sterling remembered before waking up on a leather sofa in the judge's private chambers. She refused the paramedics who tried to check her blood pressure, demanding her driver take her straight back to her desolate corporate headquarters. The 72-hour deadline the bank had given her was rapidly bleeding away. She had less than 24 hours left to produce $200 million in liquid cash. The panic in her chest felt like crushed glass every time she took a breath. There was only one asset left in her crumbling empire, valuable enough to cover that kind of staggering debt. The Sterling Pinnacle. It was a 50-story glass and steel monolith right in the very heart of Midtown Atlanta. It was the absolute crown jewel of the family portfolio. Selling it was the ultimate admission of defeat. It was a public declaration that the invincible Sterling dynasty was dead and buried. But pride was a luxury Valerie could no longer afford. She needed cash, and she needed it immediately to keep herself out of federal prison. Valerie spent the entire night locked in her office, calling every billionaire, real estate mogul, foreign investor, and private equity contact in her extensive Rolodex. She offered the tower at market value. Then she offered a 10% discount. Then 20, then 40. But the frantic phone calls all ended the exact same way. She heard polite excuses followed by dial tones. The FBI raid on the mansion had made national news. Federal agents seizing servers and freezing assets connected to the Sterling family charities had created a massive radioactive cloud over the entire family portfolio. Nobody in the financial world wanted to touch a property that might be tied up in a decade-long federal racketeering investigation. Her former friends and business partners treated the Sterling name like a highly contagious disease. They knew Connor was sitting in an interrogation room singing like a canary to save his own skin, and no one wanted to be caught in the crossfire when the indictments were unsealed. By the time the sun began to rise over the Atlanta skyline, Valerie was completely out of options. She sat alone in her dark office, staring blankly at the silent phone on her desk. She had never felt so entirely powerless in her entire life. Suddenly, an email notification chimed loudly, breaking the suffocating silence. It was a formal letter of intent from a boutique private equity firm based out of Delaware. The firm was called Twin Legacy Holdings. Valerie was too desperate to even pause and consider the strange name. She simply opened the attached purchase agreement with trembling hands. Twin Legacy Holdings was offering to buy the Sterling Pinnacle in cold, hard, liquid cash. The letter stated that the funds were already sitting in a verified escrow account, completely clear of any federal holds and ready to be transferred within the hour. It was a miracle. It was the exact lifeline Valerie needed to pay off the bank and survive another day. But when her bloodshot eyes finally scanned down to the actual purchase price, the breath caught painfully in her throat. They were offering exactly $60 million. That was barely 30% of the building's actual market value. It was a fire sale price. It was a complete and total insult to the architectural masterpiece her family had built. It was practically stealing. Valerie picked up the phone and dialed the contact number listed on the letterhead. When an anonymous broker answered, she started screaming. She demanded at least $150 million. She threatened to walk away and find another buyer. She tried to use the same aristocratic intimidation tactics that had worked for her entire career. But the broker simply let her yell until she ran out of breath. Then he calmly replied that the offer was entirely non-negotiable and that it expired in exactly 60 minutes. Valerie lowered the phone from her ear. She looked around her massive, empty office. The walls were quite literally closing in on her. Malcolm was entirely useless, hiding in a hotel room somewhere, drowning his sorrows. Connor was sitting in federal custody, naming every single one of Valerie's shell companies to cut a plea deal. Alicia had vanished completely, turning her phone off and leaving her mother to burn alone. Valerie had no leverage left. Her pristine reputation was reduced to ashes. Her empire was completely bankrupt. She looked at the blinking cursor on her computer screen, counting down the minutes until her total destruction. With tears of pure, humiliated rage streaming down her carefully lifted face, Valerie Sterling picked up her gold-plated fountain pen. Her hand shook so violently she could barely grip the metal barrel. Out of options and out of time, Valerie gritted her teeth and signed the binding sale agreement. She effectively handed over her crown jewel to a faceless corporation for absolute pennies. The ink was barely dry on the contract before Valerie began constructing the lie that would save her fragile pride. She locked the signed document in her desk drawer and walked over to the private vanity mirror in her executive washroom. She wiped away the smeared mascara and splashed freezing water on her face. She practiced her smile in the mirror over and over again. It was a terrifying, rigid stretching of her facial muscles that held absolutely no warmth. She would tell the remaining board members that liquidating the tower was a calculated strategy to pivot the Sterling portfolio toward international markets. She would spin this devastating defeat into a masterclass of corporate maneuvering. She just needed to hold the facade together long enough to survive the week and protect her social standing. Across town, in a heavily mortgaged penthouse suite, Malcolm was entirely incapable of maintaining any facade whatsoever. The expansive apartment smelled of stale whiskey and utter despair. Malcolm lay face down on the expensive Italian leather sofa, clutching an empty glass bottle to his chest. He rolled over and groggily reached for the nightstand to check the time, but his trembling hand grasped empty air. He blinked through his bloodshot eyes, staring at the bare mahogany surface. His custom-engraved Rolex, the last symbol of his artificial wealth, was completely gone. He stumbled to his feet, kicking through a sea of discarded designer clothing and empty takeout containers. Brianna was gone. Half her wardrobe was gone. The emergency cash he had hidden in the bedside drawer was gone. She had packed her bags in the middle of the night and slipped out like a thief, leaving him with nothing but a massive hangover and the crushing realization that he was entirely worthless without his mother and her money. Malcolm fell to his knees in the center of the ruined penthouse and wept loudly into his hands, mourning the shallow, pathetic life he had so carelessly thrown away. 48 hours later, the atmosphere inside the primary Sterling boardroom was heavy enough to crush bone. The long, oval table was carved from a single slab of imported black marble, reflecting the cold light of the crystal chandeliers hanging above. The remaining loyal board members sat stiffly in their high-backed leather chairs, shifting uncomfortably and exchanging anxious whispers. They knew the company was bleeding out from the federal raid on Connor, but they did not yet know the full extent of the terminal financial wounds. Valerie had kept the details of the Twin Legacy buyout completely classified. The heavy oak doors opened and Valerie swept into the room. She wore a pristine white tailored suit that screamed of untouchable wealth and unbothered arrogance. Her chin was held high and her steps were perfectly measured, hiding the sheer panic vibrating through her veins. She took her position at the head of the marble table, projecting a regal aura that demanded absolute obedience. She looked down at the men and women who had spent decades fearing and respecting her family name. "Thank you all for gathering on such short notice," Valerie said, her voice steady and echoing with forced authority. "As you are all acutely aware, we are navigating a temporary period of restructuring due to some unfortunate personal matters. We are here today to formalize a highly lucrative partnership with Twin Legacy Holdings. This strategic liquidation of the Pinnacle Tower will infuse our accounts with immediate liquid capital, allowing us to pivot toward vastly more profitable global ventures." No one spoke. The board members simply stared at her, their faces a mixture of deep skepticism and raw fear. They looked at the empty chair to her right. Malcolm was missing. Connor was in federal custody. The Golden family was entirely absent. Valerie ignored their stares and elegantly checked her diamond watch. The representative from Twin Legacy was already 10 minutes late. The sheer disrespect of making Valerie Sterling wait in her own boardroom was enough to make her blood boil, but she forced her jaw to relax. She tapped her manicured fingernails against the edge of the cold marble table. The rhythmic clicking sound echoed in the suffocating silence of the room. Every second that ticked by felt like an agonizing eternity. Valerie stared intently at the heavy oak doors, waiting for the faceless corporate buyers to arrive and finally take the keys to her kingdom. The heavy oak doors finally swung open, and the entire room went dead silent. Two men in sharp charcoal suits walked in carrying thick leather briefcases. They were the senior representatives from the bank handling the escrow transfer. They stepped into the room and immediately moved to the side, flanking the entrance like royal guards making way for their superior. The rhythmic clicking of high heels echoed against the marble floor. The sound was slow and deliberate, cutting through the suffocating tension in the boardroom. I stepped through the doorway. I wore a razor-sharp crimson power suit that fit me like armor. My hair was perfectly styled, my posture immaculate, and my presence completely dominating the space. I did not look like the discarded, exhausted ex-wife they all thought I was. I looked like a conqueror stepping onto a defeated battlefield. Valerie froze. The color instantly drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. Her manicured fingers gripped the edge of the black marble table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. For a long moment, the mighty matriarch of the Sterling Empire was completely speechless. Her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and growing terror. Then the shock curdled into furious, indignant rage. "What the hell are you doing here?" Valerie shrieked, her voice cracking with unhinged panic, losing every ounce of her carefully maintained, regal aura. "Security, get in here immediately! Remove this woman from my building right now!" No one moved. The bank representatives remained perfectly still. The loyal board members simply stared in stunned silence, too paralyzed by the bizarre turn of events to even reach for their phones. I ignored her screaming completely. I walked calmly down the length of the massive table, my heels clicking a steady, merciless rhythm until I stood directly across from Valerie. I held a thick leather dossier in my right hand. I raised it slightly and then dropped it onto the polished stone surface. It landed with a loud, heavy thud that made Valerie physically flinch in her chair. I looked down at the trembling woman who had spent years trying to destroy me, trying to steal my children, and trying to erase my entire existence. "I am the Chief Executive Officer and primary shareholder of Twin Legacy Holdings." I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm, carrying easily to every corner of the silent boardroom. "Hello, former mother-in-law. You just officially sold your entire empire to me." Valerie stared at the dossier, and then back up at my face. Her mouth hung open in absolute horror as her brain finally processed the words. "Twin Legacy." She whispered the syllables tasting like ash in her dry mouth. The twins. Yes, Valerie, I replied, leaning forward slightly, resting my hands on the cold marble. Named after the children you just tried to steal from me in family court. The children Malcolm signed away the rights to because you were too arrogant to read the fine print of your own prenuptial agreement. You thought you were selling your crown jewel to a faceless corporation in Delaware to save your skin. But you were just handing the keys directly to me. Valerie's legs completely gave out. She collapsed back into her high-backed leather chair, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull oxygen into her lungs. The remaining board members began muttering among themselves, their eyes darting from Valerie to the signed contract and back to me. They knew exactly what this meant. The Sterling era was officially over, and their almighty leader had just been outplayed by the woman they had all underestimated. The funds have already cleared escrow, I stated, turning my attention briefly to the bank representatives who nodded in formal confirmation. The transaction is complete and legally binding. The Sterling Pinnacle now belongs to me. And my first order of business as the new owner is to clear the trash out of my building. Valerie opened her mouth, but the words completely died in her dry throat. The mighty matriarch of the Sterling Empire was suddenly reduced to a gasping fish out of water. The remaining board members sat frozen in their high-backed leather chairs, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the corporate coup they were witnessing. I walked slowly around the enormous black marble table, letting my heels click against the floor with a deliberate and merciless rhythm. I stopped right beside Valerie and her rigid, trembling form and flipped open the thick leather dossier I had thrown down moments ago. "Let us do some simple math, Valerie," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the dead silent boardroom. "It is time to balance the ledgers you spent a lifetime manipulating. I know how much you love numbers, especially when you believe they are stacked in your favor. You see, when Connor was raided by the FBI and your philanthropic embezzlement was splashed across every major news network, the market instantly panicked. The pristine Sterling name became absolute poison overnight. Your investors were terrified and started jumping ship. The major banks were terrified of federal subpoenas and endless audits. And your corporate bonds, those beautiful high-yield debt instruments that kept your entire real estate empire afloat, plummeted to absolute junk status in a matter of hours. The financial sharks smelled blood in the water, and they wanted nothing to do with a sinking ship tied to federal fraud charges. You remember the $45 million you thought you so cleverly hid in those offshore accounts? I continued casually turning a page in the thick dossier to reveal a stack of wire transfer confirmations. The money you desperately tried to use to buy your way out of the massive financial hole Malcolm dug for this family. Well, when I assumed control of Twin Legacy Holdings, I did not just sit on that cash. I weaponized it against you. I used your own stolen $45 million as maximum leverage to quietly buy up every single piece of the Sterling family distressed debt during the height of the market panic. All the bonds, all the outstanding commercial loans, all the overextended leverage the banks were desperate to offload to avoid federal scrutiny. I bought it all for pennies on the dollar through a network of anonymous shell companies you could not possibly trace. I was the one dictating the terms while you were busy trying to save your crumbling social standing. A collective gasp rippled through the remaining board members sitting around the table. They were seasoned financial executives, and they understood exactly what I was describing. Valerie's face turned an even more sickly shade of pale gray as the horrific reality began to sink into her arrogant mind. "In simple terms, Valerie," I murmured, leaning down so my face was just inches from hers. "You funded me to buy your own debt. I own your commercial mortgages. I own your corporate loans. And as of 10 minutes ago, I officially own your flagship building." I pulled a sleek silver pen from my tailored jacket pocket and began drawing heavy lines on the top financial document in the dossier. "Let us tally up the final score, shall we?" I said, loud enough for the entire room to hear every single devastating word. We start with the total value of your remaining liquid assets, which we just established is the exact $60 million I paid you for this tower today. Now we subtract Malcolm's massive hidden losses from his failed crypto ventures, his gambling debts, and the money his mistress stole before she abandoned him in a cheap motel, which total roughly $28 million. Then we subtract Connor's generous embezzlement from the family charity, which the federal government has already tagged at another $32 million in immediate fines and non-negotiable restitution. I drew a heavy black line across the bottom of the financial statement and wrote a single large zero. Carrying the two and accounting for the massive legal fees you are about to incur to keep yourself out of a federal prison cell, your current net worth, Valerie, is exactly $0. You have absolutely nothing left. Not the buildings, not the hidden trusts, not the sterling legacy. It is all entirely gone. I paused and reached into my pocket, pulling out a crumpled white piece of paper. I smoothed it out against the marble and placed it gently on top of the large zero I had just drawn on the ledger. Actually, I said, tilting my head in a mock display of sincere apology, I am afraid my math was slightly off. I bought a rather expensive vanilla latte on my way up here to fire you. So technically, subtracting your massive liabilities from your absolute lack of assets, you actually owe me $12.50 for my coffee this morning. The silence in the boardroom was absolutely deafening. It was the kind of heavy silence that follows a fatal car crash. The bank representatives who had facilitated the transfer stood quietly against the wall, their faces completely impassive, but their eyes reflecting a deep professional awe at the execution of my trap. Valerie stared blankly at the crumpled coffee receipt resting on the polished marble table. Her perfectly manicured hands were shaking so violently she had to cross her arms tightly over her chest just to keep them still. She looked around the large room, searching desperately for a single ally, a single loyal soldier who would stand up and defend the sterling name. But there was no one left to fight for her. The board members, the people she had enriched and intimidated for decades, absolutely refused to even make eye contact with her. They were already looking at me, calculating how they could save their own lucrative positions under my new administration. They recognized true power when they saw it, and they knew the woman standing at the head of the table in the crimson suit held all of it. Valerie was a ghost haunting a building she no longer owned. Valerie Sterling, the woman who had ruled Atlanta high society with an iron fist, slowly rose from her chair. Her legs trembled so violently she had to lean heavily on the marble table just to remain upright. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving behind the hollow shell of a defeated tyrant. She tried to formulate a response to summon some shred of her former dignity, but the sheer magnitude of her ruin had finally broken her mind. I suggest you start packing your personal belongings. Valerie, I said, stepping back from the table and gesturing toward the heavy oak doors. My security team will escort you to the service elevator. I do not want you using the main lobby. It might upset my new tenants to see a bankrupt woman crying on her way out of the building. The heavy oak doors suddenly burst open before Valerie could even force a sound past her trembling lips. Malcolm stumbled into the boardroom looking like a hollowed-out shell of the arrogant heir I had once married. His designer suit was deeply wrinkled, smelling faintly of stale alcohol and sheer panic. He had clearly rushed here looking for his mother, hoping she could pull one last miracle out of her pristine pockets to save him from his creditors. He froze the moment he saw me standing at the head of the black marble table. His bloodshot eyes darted from my crimson power suit to the bank representatives, and finally to his mother, who was currently gripping the table like a woman standing on the edge of a cliff. "Sydney!" He choked out, his voice cracking. "What are you doing here?" "I just bought your family legacy." "Malcolm," I stated cleanly. "And I used the $45 million your mother thought she was hiding to do it." The last shred of Valerie Sterling carefully crafted sanity evaporated into the cold air. The untouchable high society matriarch, the woman who had terrorized me for years, simply snapped. She slammed her fists down on the marble table with a sickening crack. "You filthy little thief!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the room like a jagged knife. Her perfect white suit suddenly looked absurd against the raw, unhinged fury contorting her face. You stole this from us. You set us up. You set my boys up to fail. I will destroy you for this, Sydney. I will drag you through every court in the country until you are begging on the streets. I stood perfectly still, letting her scream. The board members shrank back in their chairs, horrified by the ugly, primal sound of her breakdown. All that refined elegance, all that country club superiority was gone, replaced by the vicious, desperate cursing of a woman who had just realized she had nothing left. She hurled every ugly insult she could think of, her face turning a deep mottled red as she gasped for breath. She cursed my name. She cursed her lawyers. She even cursed the bank representative standing quietly against the wall. It was a pathetic display, but I felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no intimidation, and certainly no pity. You destroyed yourselves, Valerie, I said quietly when she finally ran out of breath. I just gave you enough rope to hang your own empire. Malcolm fell to his knees. The sound of his knees hitting the hard marble floor echoed loudly over his mother's ragged breathing. He crawled forward slightly, his hands reaching out toward my pristine heels. The golden boy of the Sterling family, the man who had treated me like a disposable accessory, was now kneeling in the dirt begging for scraps. "Sydney, please," he sobbed, tears cutting paths through the grime on his face. "Brianna left me. The accounts are completely frozen. The creditors are threatening to take the car, the clothes, everything. I have nowhere to go. Please, Sydney, you won. You beat us. Just give me a job. Any job. I can work in the mailroom. I can manage the lower portfolios. Just let me stay. Please do not leave me with nothing." Valerie let out a sound of pure disgust. "Get up, Malcolm," she hissed violently, kicking at his leg. "Do not you dare beg that woman for anything. Stand up, you pathetic excuse for a man." But Malcolm ignored her completely, crying openly as he stared up at me with desperate red-rimmed eyes. I looked down at the man who had shattered my trust, who had spit on our vows, who had allowed his mother to strip me of my dignity for years. I saw the weak, cowardly boy hiding behind the Sterling name, a name that now belonged entirely to me. "You do not have the qualifications to work in my mailroom." "Malcolm," I replied, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Twin Legacy Holdings only employs individuals with integrity." I turned away from the miserable scene on the floor and walked over to the sleek communication console built into the center of the marble table. I reached out and pressed the silver intercom button. My voice echoed through the hidden speakers connecting directly to the main security desk downstairs. "Security," I said calmly. "This is Sydney, the new owner of the building. Please send an escort to the primary boardroom on the top floor immediately. I have 2 unauthorized guests who need to be removed from the premises." "You cannot do this!" Valerie screamed, lunging forward slightly before stopping herself. "This is my building. This is my city." The intercom crackled to life. "Right away, Mom," the deep voice of the security chief answered. "And one more thing," I added, ignoring Valerie completely. "Once Valerie and Malcolm Sterling are escorted out, I want their faces added to the permanent restricted list, deactivate their keycards, flag their license plates, and revoke all parking privileges. They are to be permanently banned from the premises. If they set one foot on this property again, you have my full authorization to have them arrested for trespassing." "Understood, Mom," the chief replied. Malcolm let out a loud, pathetic wail, burying his face in his hands. Valerie stood frozen, her chest heaving as she stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. But beneath the hatred, I saw the terror finally settling into her bones. She realized there was no clever spin for this. No society column could fix it. No expensive lawyer could undo it. The empire she had built on the broken backs of others had just collapsed on top of her. The heavy oak doors opened and 4 large security guards in crisp black uniforms stepped into the boardroom. They moved with swift professional efficiency, completely ignoring the shocked stares of the remaining board members. 2 guards stepped up to Valerie, gesturing toward the door, while the other 2 hauled a weeping Malcolm to his feet by his armpits. "Get your hands off me!" Valerie spat, jerking her arm away from the nearest guard. "I know the way out." She straightened her jacket, trying desperately to summon one last shred of dignity. But it was useless. She looked like a ruined queen being marched to the guillotine. As the guards escorted them toward the heavy oak doors, I turned my attention back to the bank representatives and the trembling executives sitting around the table. Now that the distraction has been handled, I said, taking my seat at the head of the marble table. Let us discuss the future of Twin Legacy Holdings. The meeting that followed was the most productive in the history of that boardroom. Within an hour, the remaining executives understood that a new era had begun. There was no more sterling arrogance to hide behind. There was only efficiency and profit. I left the building that afternoon feeling lighter than I had in years. The shadow of the Sterling family had been completely eradicated from my life. Over the next few months, the absolute destruction of the Sterling family became a cautionary tale, whispered in every country club and corporate office in Atlanta. The consequences of their greed caught up to each of them with ruthless precision. Connor, the golden child who thought he was untouchable, was the first to fall completely. The federal prosecutors showed absolutely no mercy. The embezzlement charges, combined with wire fraud and money laundering, carried a mandatory minimum sentence. The man who used to complain if his imported silk suits were pressed incorrectly was now wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary in a facility far away from the comforts he had always taken for granted. His wife, Alicia, did not even show up for his sentencing hearing. The moment the FBI had raided their home, she had packed a single bag and contacted a vicious divorce attorney. She officially filed for divorce while Connor was still sitting in a holding cell. Alicia liquidated whatever personal assets she had hidden away and vanished. Rumors said she moved out west, changing her last name and living in complete hiding, terrified that the Sterling taint would ruin her social life forever. Brianna, the mistress who had helped destroy my marriage, thought she had escaped the sinking ship when she slipped out of Malcolm's heavily mortgaged penthouse. She had always considered herself a survivor, a predator who knew exactly how to move from one host to another. She relocated to Miami, hoping to reinvent herself and latch onto another wealthy man. For a few weeks, she haunted the upscale hotel bars and exclusive yacht clubs, playing the role of a misunderstood heiress. She set her sights on a young tech mogul, showering him with the same calculated affection she had used on Malcolm. But the internet never forgets. A woman at a charity gala recognized Brianna from the highly publicized Sterling scandal. Within hours, a detailed post exposing her as a gold-digging homewrecker went completely viral across local social media networks. Women shared her photo, warning their husbands and brothers. Hotel managers and club promoters quietly added her to their restricted lists. The tech mogul canceled their weekend getaway and blocked her number. Brianna was completely blacklisted from the luxury circles she craved, ending up working as a hostess in a cheap sports bar just to pay her rent. But the most poetic justice was reserved for Valerie and Malcolm. Without the Pinnacle Tower, and with their personal accounts frozen by the banks, the sprawling Sterling estate in Buckhead went into immediate foreclosure. The eviction was swift and entirely unceremonious. There were no moving trucks carefully wrapping expensive antiques. The bank simply changed the locks and allowed them to carry out whatever they could fit into a few black garbage bags. The woman who used to host charity galas in a ballroom the size of a museum was forced to rent a tiny rundown apartment in a working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. It was the exact type of neighborhood Valerie used to endlessly mock when we drove past it in her chauffeured town car. Now it was her permanent reality. The apartment smelled faintly of old cooking oil and damp wood. The floors were covered in peeling yellow linoleum and the walls were paper-thin. Every time a truck drove by outside, the cheap single-pane windows rattled in their frames. Valerie spent her days sitting in a stained armchair, staring blankly at a small television she had bought from a pawn shop. Her pristine white suits were gone, replaced by cheap sweatpants that she never bothered to wash. The sheer horror of her new existence had broken her spirit entirely. She was surrounded by the very people she had spent a lifetime looking down upon, and they paid absolutely no attention to her. Malcolm was forced to confront a reality he was entirely unequipped to handle. Without his trust fund and his mother's endless financial bailouts, he actually had to find a job to keep them from starving. The former vice president of Sterling Acquisitions, who used to fire people just for looking at him wrong, now worked the graveyard shift at a local distribution warehouse. He spent his nights hauling heavy cardboard boxes and loading delivery trucks, his soft manicured hands covered in blisters and thick calluses. He was constantly yelled at by supervisors who were a decade younger than him, and he had to swallow his pride and take it, because he desperately needed the minimum wage paycheck. Sometimes on my drive home from the new Twin Legacy headquarters, I would take a slight detour. I would drive past the warehouse where Malcolm worked or the cheap apartment complex where Valerie hid from the world. I never stopped and I never gloated. Simply seeing the reality of their consequences was enough. The universe had a beautiful way of balancing the scales. They had tried to strip me of my dignity, my children, and my future. Instead, they had lost everything they valued most. Their wealth, their status, and their precious sterling name were gone forever, replaced by a life of endless grinding struggle. 6 months had passed since the day I tore the Sterling Empire down to its very foundations and reclaimed my life from the ashes. The autumn air rolling over the expansive glass balcony of my penthouse tower was crisp and clean, carrying the faint metallic scent of the bustling city below. Atlanta stretched out before me in a sprawling, magnificent grid of golden lights and endless, restless energy. I stood by the thick glass railing, letting the cool night wind wash over my face and tangle in my hair. The silence up here was profound and absolute. It was the kind of heavy, peaceful silence that only comes after a violent, deafening storm has finally exhausted itself and passed over the horizon. I owned this tower now. I owned the very air moving through its massive ventilation systems and the polished marble floors beneath my bare feet. The giant, glowing neon letters that once spelled out Sterling across the crown of the building had been dismantled piece by piece and hauled away for scrap metal months ago. In their place, the sleek, minimalist logo of Twin Legacy Holdings glowed quietly against the dark night sky. It was a beacon of survival and a permanent monument to a mother who absolutely refused to let her children be sold to the highest bidder. I looked down at the busy streets far below, watching the tiny headlights of cars moving like blood through the concrete veins of the city. I thought about the terrified, exhausted woman I used to be, the woman who had allowed herself to be shrunk down and silenced to fit into the suffocating artificial mold Valerie Sterling had built for her. I had spent years trying to earn the basic approval of people who viewed human beings as nothing more than depreciating assets on a spreadsheet. I had swallowed their endless insults. I had absorbed their passive-aggressive cruelty, and I had almost let them convince me that I was the one who was crazy. But that frail, compliant woman was entirely gone. She had died the exact moment Valerie handed me that predatory contract and tried to purchase my unborn children like they were real estate acquisitions. The woman standing on this balcony tonight was forged in the blinding fire of their ultimate betrayal. I had taken their arrogance, their blinding greed, and their absolute certainty that they were untouchable, and I had used those exact things to completely dismantle their privileged lives. I turned away from the sweeping view of the city and stepped back inside the warmth of the penthouse. The heavy glass door slid shut silently behind me, instantly cutting off the low hum of the urban landscape. The interior of the penthouse was completely unrecognizable from the cold, sterile museum Malcolm had once insisted upon. The harsh modern angles, the impractical glass tables, and the uncomfortable designer furniture had all been stripped away and replaced with genuine warmth. Soft, textured fabrics, plush woven rugs, and framed photographs filled the expansive space, making it feel like a real home, rather than a high society showroom meant only to impress shallow guests. I walked softly down the wide hallway, my bare feet making no sound on the smooth, heated hardwood floors. I stopped in front of the nursery door, pushing it gently open just a few inches. The room was bathed in the soft amber glow of a small corner nightlight. I stepped inside, breathing in the sweet powdery scent of baby lotion and clean folded laundry. My twins were sleeping peacefully in their matching solid wood cribs. I stood perfectly still between them, watching the steady rhythmic rise and fall of their tiny chests. They were completely healthy, growing stronger and more vibrant with every passing day. I reached out and gently rested my hand against my daughter's, warm back, feeling her slow, steady heartbeat against my palm. She stirred slightly, letting out a soft, contented sigh before settling back into a deep, restful sleep. I moved to my son's crib, brushing a soft curl of dark hair away from his forehead. He had my eyes and my quiet resilience. Staring down at their innocent, perfect faces, I felt a surge of love so powerful it physically ached deep in my chest. This was what the Sterling family had tried to steal from me. This pure, unconditional, profound connection. Valerie had looked at these beautiful, vulnerable children and seen nothing but leverage and legacy. She had viewed them as property to be managed, as heirs to be molded into the exact same toxic image as her own broken sons. She thought she could simply write a massive check and erase the mother who had carried them. She severely underestimated the primal, ferocious instinct of a mother protecting her young from predators. My children would never know the cold, calculating cruelty of Valerie Sterling. They would never have to endure the pathetic weakness, the gambling addictions, and the endless lies of a father like Malcolm. They would grow up in a home filled with warmth, honesty, and absolute security. They would be taught that true wealth is measured in character, compassion, and integrity, not in hidden offshore accounts and exclusive country club memberships. They were safe, forever shielded by an empire I had built with my own two hands and my own unbreakable will. I left the nursery, pulling the door almost shut behind me, and walked back out into the main living area. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the kitchen island and leaned back against the cool marble counter. The last 6 months at Twin Legacy Holdings had been a period of explosive, unprecedented growth and complete corporate transformation. Once the suffocating bureaucracy, the rampant nepotism, and the deep corruption of the Sterling family were violently removed, the company had begun to heal and thrive almost immediately. I had spent my first month as chief executive officer ruthlessly purging the executive board. I fired every single cowardly sycophant, every blind enabler, and every corrupt manager who had helped Valerie and Connor maintain their decades-long reign of terror. I replaced them with the brilliant, undervalued financial analysts and hard-working, everyday employees who had been doing the actual heavy lifting for years, while the Sterling men took all the credit and the massive bonuses. The corporate culture shifted overnight. Fear, intimidation, and toxic competition were replaced by open collaboration, transparency, and genuine innovation. I also made it my personal mission to immediately repair the massive damage Connor had done to the family charity foundation. I quietly diverted a significant portion of our first quarter profits to completely refund the embezzled accounts, restoring the stolen money with interest. We then launched entirely new philanthropic initiatives focusing heavily on affordable housing and urban development programs that actually help the working-class neighborhoods. Valerie used to endlessly mock from the back seat of her chauffeured car. The local industry journals and national financial magazines that had once eagerly covered the scandalous, spectacular downfall of the Sterling family were now publishing glowing feature profiles on my aggressive restructuring tactics and the complete ethical rebirth of the commercial real estate company. My mind drifted briefly to the original architects of my former misery. I rarely thought about the Sterling family anymore. The ultimate victory was not just taking their hoarded wealth, but achieving complete and total emotional indifference to their miserable existence. I knew Connor was currently sitting in a tiny concrete cell in a high-security federal penitentiary, learning exactly how little his imported Italian silk suits and arrogant, demanding tone mattered on the inside of a cell block. His days of ordering expensive aged scotch and laughing cruelly at the misfortune of his subordinates were permanently over-replaced by the harsh, rigid, regimented reality of federal prison life and awful cafeteria food. I knew his former wife Alicia was still living in deep hiding somewhere out west, desperately trying to scrub the sterling name from her legal identity. She was terrified that the lingering stench of her husband's massive federal crimes would ruin her desperate, pathetic attempts at social climbing in a new city. I knew Brianna. The opportunistic, parasitic mistress who had happily helped destroy my marriage was currently pouring cheap draft beer and wiping down sticky tables for ungrateful, loud tourists in Miami. Her grand illusions of luxury and unearned wealth had been completely shattered by her own viral infamy. She was a permanent ghost in the high society world she had tried so desperately and ruthlessly to infiltrate, completely blacklisted from every yacht club and luxury hotel in the state. And I knew exactly where Valerie and Malcolm were. They were still trapped in that damp, peeling tiny apartment on the far industrial outskirts of the city. They were living the exact terrible nightmare they had always looked down upon with such intense disgust. Valerie, the former untouchable matriarch of elite Atlanta society, was now just an angry, bitter, forgotten woman sitting all day in a stained fabric armchair, watching a cheap pawn-shop television. She had absolutely no friends left, no charity boards to terrorize, and no money to buy false loyalty. Malcolm, the former golden boy and heir apparent, was ruining his soft, useless hands, working the grueling graveyard shift at a local medical supply distribution warehouse. He spent his long, miserable nights hauling heavy cardboard boxes and loading delivery trucks, constantly yelled at and belittled by supervisors, who were a full decade younger than him. He had to swallow his massive, fragile pride and take the verbal abuse every single night, because he desperately needed the minimum wage paycheck just to keep the lights on in their terrible apartment. They had absolutely nothing left in this world but their bitter, toxic resentment for each other. I felt absolutely no pity for any of them. They had meticulously dug their own deep graves and happily jumped inside, expecting me to throw dirt on myself. I had simply handed them the shovels and walked away. They had played a very dangerous, arrogant game with my life. They had looked at me and seen a naive, disposable, easily manipulated girl from a working-class background. They thought my basic human kindness was a fatal weakness they could easily exploit for their own comfort. They thought my deep, desperate love for my unborn children was a strategic vulnerability they could leverage for their own financial gain. I set my glass down on the smooth counter and walked slowly back out onto the expansive glass balcony. The night wind had picked up slightly, carrying the distant sirens and sounds of a city that never completely slept. I leaned my hands against the cool glass railing, looking out over the massive, glowing empire that now belonged entirely and legally to me and my children. I let out a slow, contented breath as a genuine, peaceful smile spread across my face. They thought $45 million could buy motherhood and dignity. They honestly believed they could purchase my children and erase my entire existence with a simple wire transfer and a handful of forged legal documents. They treated human lives like lines on a balance sheet, moving numbers around until the math perfectly suited their selfish desires. But the most painful lesson in finance is what happens when you miscalculate the true value of your assets. My mother-in-law deeply undervalued me. And the market always corrects arrogance. This time I am the market. The most profound lesson we can take from this story is that your true worth is never defined by the people who desperately try to keep you small. Toxic environments and manipulative family members often rely on tearing you down because their own control depends entirely on your compliance and your self-doubt. They will treat you like a disposable asset, constantly comparing you to others and trying to convince you that you are absolutely nothing without their conditional approval or their inherited wealth. But their biggest mistake and their ultimate downfall is always their own arrogance. When they severely underestimate you, they blindly hand you the exact weapon you need to break free. True power does not come from dramatic screaming matches or begging for basic respect from people who are fiercely committed to misunderstanding you. True power comes from quiet, calculated, and unbreakable resilience. It comes from taking all the intense pain, the relentless insults, and the blatant disrespect and channeling every ounce of that energy into building a life where their opinions no longer matter. When you finally detach your self-worth from their toxic narrative, you realize that you were never the broken one. You were simply the convenient target for their deep insecurities. You do not need their validation to build an empire of your own, whether that empire is a massively successful company or simply a peaceful, safe home filled with genuine, unconditional love. By focusing entirely on your own growth and fiercely protecting your peace, you completely rewrite the rules of the game they forced you to play. The most satisfying victory is not just watching their inevitable consequences unfold, but reaching a point where you feel complete absolute indifference toward their existence. You are not a depreciating liability, and you never were. You are the absolute master of your own fate. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to build your own success? Share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more stories of ultimate revenge and personal triumph.